Shalom, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, welcome, world changers. Today, we're going to compare the Masoretic and the Septuagint and the New Testament. We're going to find out who quoted what authors of the New Testament quoted the Septuagint, which ones quoted the Masoretic. Did they quote one or the other, or both, a mixture of both? We're going to talk about all of this today. Hope you all are doing awesome today. Just before we get into it, let's see what we have here in the live chat. Chipmunk says, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Hubert says, Shabbat Shalom, family in Christ. Seek the Lord says, Shabbat Shalom. Calamento says, Shabbat Shalom to all. Well, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome and blessings to y'all. Blessings multiplied to you and your families. Okay, well, this is something that I've been talking about doing for a little while now, and now's the day. Today's the day to do this. So let's get right into this. I am going to be addressing the general consensus of what passages in the Old Testament were either a direct quotation or an explicit mention, if you will, in the New Testament. And we're going to look at, we're going to answer the question, or at least attempt to do it to the best of our ability. What did the New Testament quote from? The Septuagint or the Masoretic text? You know, since this is a Shabbat live stream, I want to also leave the chat open, or I should say, you know, anybody that has any prayer requests, feel free to send me an email and let me know about those prayer requests. You can find the email right here up on the screen, ChristopherEnoch@proton.me, ChristopherEnoch@proton.me, and yeah, and I'm going to be checking this every once in a while over the next little while here while we're live. And even when we're not live, you can send me an email, a prayer request, and we can do that. If any of you would like to come on as a guest, and we spoke about this before, if you have a testimony, praise report, or anything of that nature, you can also let me know about that as well in the live chat. If I know you, meaning that you know, you are especially members of the channel, if you're a member of the channel, then I'm not going to require you to turn your camera on or anything like that. If I don't know you, I will be asking you to turn your camera on. We want to make sure that we don't have, we want to keep a little bit of eye on the trolling situation here. All right. Yeah, I want to make the experience for y'all the best possible experience. So let's begin here. Oh, by the way, share the live stream, share before we get into it. So today I'm not going to be talking a whole lot about, you know, some of the controversial issues such as Paul or the Torah per se. This is going to be just like black and white evidence. You know, this is what the New Testament says that the quote-unquote Old Testament's supposed to say. Let's go and check it out. And we're just going to be looking at just the facts. And if you don't know, by the way, that a lot of times your New Testament doesn't line up with the so-called Old Testament quotations, then you're going to find out something today. All right, so share the live stream. All right, so let's begin here. Because the ancient authors sometimes combined concepts from multiple sources or quoted from the Greek Septuagint translation rather than the original Hebrew, exact numbering can vary slightly among biblical indexes. However, this sequence represents the general accepted scholarly consensus for the first 150 direct quotes. So we're going to look at the first 150. By the way, there are like 200 plus, almost 300, depending on how you enumerate this. And I'm saying depending on how we enumerate this because there are instances where it says, like, for example, it is written, and it's like just a patchwork of different quotations from the Old Testament. Like, it's not really a quote, if you will, like a quote and an unquote, but it's just a collage of different verses from different books all slapped together in one so-called reference. So this is why it's not as easy as you might think it would be to do something like this. So the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 23 is what we're going to first look at. Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. Okay. Well, we'll put it into a little bit of context. We'll start with verse 18 just to couch it within its original context here. Matthew chapter 1, verse 18, now the birth of Jesus Christ was like this. After his mother Mary was engaged to Joseph, before they came together, she was found pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not willing to make her a public example, intended to put her away secretly. In other words, divorce her. Verse 20, or annul the, you could say annul the engagement, if you will. But when he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, don't be afraid to take to yourself Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She shall give birth to a son, you shall name him Jesus, for it is he who shall save his people from their sins. Kind of weird, by the way, that they would put it this way, because there were a lot of people back in those days. Well, it's not like your typical John, but there was a fair amount of people that had the same name. Yeshua, Yahushua, Yeshua, Yeshu, okay? It's all basically the same name, different ways of saying it. Long form, middle form, short form, if you will. So, Matthew puts it here to say that you shall name him Jesus because he shall save his people from their sins. Not, he kind of ignores the fact that there's a lot of other people named Jesus there. Verse 22, now all this has happened that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, quote, so here's supposed to be a quotation. Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall give birth to a son. They shall call his name Emmanuel, which is, being interpreted, God with us. Okay, so what passage is this quoting? This is supposed to be Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. So let's go over there, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. And I'm going to use the Blue Letter Bible because we have a lot of different Bible translators that do not translate this. They embellish. You know that? A lot of translators don't really translate. They change the text to make it say what they think it should say. So, in the King James lines it right up with the New Testament, saying, it says, therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive, bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And then the New King James also says that. There's a footnote on Emmanuel. It says literally God with us. But the New King James is not honest here about this word virgin. We could give the King James translators a pass because, well, maybe we shouldn't give them a pass either. Yeah, they didn't have a whole lot of manuscripts back in the day, in the late 1500s, early 1600s. They didn't have a whole lot of manuscripts to reference from like we do today. but they should have had the Masoretic Hebrew text that has the word alma in it instead of betula. The word alma means young woman. The word betula means virgin. Here in the Hebrew, it says alma here, which is not the word for virgin. So the King James and the New King James so-called quote-unquote translators don't really translate the text. They impose their interpretation upon the text. Now, let's have a look at some of the other Bible translations. The New Living Translation, although it gets a bad rap on a lot of things, it does actually deliver on some good things like this. For example, so New Living Translation says, all right then, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the virgin will conceive a child. There's a footnote here, and it says, or young woman. See this? Or young woman. NIV says the same thing. It's got a footnote. Or young woman. You might say, oh, but it's a virgin because Matthew said it's a virgin. Well, why would he say it's a virgin? Because the Hebrew doesn't really say that. The Hebrew says young woman, not virgin. We're going to find out, folks. But let's have a look at some of the other Bible translations here. The ESV, unfortunately, does not give you the actual truth here behind it. The ESV does not give you the truth behind it. It just leaves you to believe that it means virgin. CSB also doesn't give you the truth. CSB, well, actually, you know what? There is a footnote here. It says, see, the virgin will conceive. Footnote, virgin is pregnant, will have a son. So even the CSB doesn't tell you, and CSB is usually pretty good on many fronts. I like the CSB on lots of other issues, but this one here, these people, if you're a translator from the CSB and you're listening to this, tisk, you should have put it in there. Why have so many footnotes here? You got 1, 2, 3 footnotes here, but you leave out the major one, which is the word virgin should be young woman. NASB also, well, the NASB has it in the footnotes. It says, as in the LXX, which is a Septuagint, Masoretic text, young unmarried woman. That's not all that accurate either, because the word alma doesn't really necessarily mean unmarried either. Okay? It doesn't. It just simply means young woman. The NASB 95 is a little bit more accurate by saying maiden. Okay? It's a little bit more accurate that way, maiden, but still it gives the idea that it's a virgin. LSB also has the footnote maiden. Amplified. Okay, so the Amplified has a lot to say here. Okay, we're not going to read all that, but the Amplified does have a footnote there. So here's the thing. The Hebrew text says alma, which means young woman. But if we go to an older manuscript, the Septuagint, that's several hundred years older, and we read it, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, the word for virgin here in the Greek is virgin. So what does that mean for us? That means that Matthew, he did not quote the Hebrew. He quoted the Greek because he used the exact same Greek word as the Septuagint uses. Our next quotation from the New Testament of the Old Testament is Matthew chapter 2, verse 6. And it says, you Bethlehem. Well, first of all, sorry, let's do the verse before. So they said to him in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is written through the prophet. You Bethlehem, land of Judah, are in no way least among the princes of Judah, for out of you shall come a governor who shall shepherd my people Israel. Okay, so what prophet is he referring to here? It's Micah chapter 5, verse 2. So in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, it says, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah. Well, wait a second here. In Matthew, it says, you Bethlehem, land of Judah. But the real Hebrew says, you Bethlehem Ephrathah, being small among the clans of Judah. The Matthew says it's supposed to say, you Bethlehem, land of Judah, are in no way least among the princes of Judah. Does it actually say that? Being small among the clans of Judah. Being small among the clans of Judah. So this is almost a contradiction. You see this? So in Micah chapter 5, it says, being small among the clans of Judah. Matthew says it's supposed to say, are in no way least among the princes of Judah. Micah goes on to say, out of you one shall come to me who is to be ruler in Israel. Let's look at what Matthew says here. For out of you shall come a governor who shall shepherd my people Israel. So that's not what it says. It doesn't say anything. It says in the Hebrew, WEB translation, out of you one will come out to me who is to be ruler in Israel. You see how different this is? Matthew says it's supposed to say, for out of you shall come a governor who shall shepherd my people Israel. Very different. If I quoted the Bible like that, I'd have a lot more hate in the comment section than I do already. If I said, Isaiah said, quote and unquote, and I and I quoted it like that, like even made a contradiction in the quote, and said stuff that it doesn't really say, I can just imagine how much my haters would jump down my beloved haters out there. They would jump down my throat more than they do already. So Matthew stops there. He stops the quote. Micah doesn't stop there. It goes on, whose goings out are of old from ancient times. So, we got a problem. What in the world was Matthew quoting? Did he make it up? Did he make this up? Or was there another manuscript that he had? Let's check out the Septuagint. The Septuagint says, and thou, Bethlehem, house of Ephrathah. Again, it says Ephrathah. So that the Septuagint confirms what it says here in the Masoretic text, Bethlehem Ephrathah. Okay, this is the Brenton translation of the Septuagint, by the way, are few in number to be reckoned among the thousands of Judah. Which it confirms what the Masoretic says here. And it's contradictory to what Matthew says, in no way least among the princes of Judah, compared to few in number to be reckoned among the thousands of Judah. The Septuagint says, yet out of you shall one come forth to me to be ruler in Israel. So that's, again, very much like the Masoretic. Out of you, the Masoretic says, out of you will come out to me one who is to be ruler in Israel. The Septuagint says, and his goings forth were from the beginning, even from eternity, which is very similar to the Masoretic text, which Matthew leaves out. So, what was Matthew quoting from? What was he quoting from? Was he quoting from the Masoretic? Was he quoting from the Septuagint? Or from some other manuscript? It doesn't seem like it certainly isn't a direct quote of the Hebrew, and it really isn't a direct quote of the Greek either. So it's either he had a manuscript that we don't have today, a lost manuscript, or he had different manuscript that is not common today, or he just kind of made stuff up as he went. He kind of just changed stuff as he went. So it isn't a direct quote. As you can see, right before your eyes right here, this is not a direct quote. I mean, can you imagine if I quoted the scriptures like Matthew did? What do you guys think in the live chat? What do you think Matthew is doing here? So Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, the very same chapter, verse 15 is our next one. Matthew chapter 2, verse 15 says, I'll start at verse 14 again for context. He arose and took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. Okay, so let's go to the actual text that it's supposed to be quoting, and that is Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Hubert says, I think Matthew is Matthewing. Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing. Thank you, Huberts. Matthew does this a lot. We've been talking about this several days ago in our live streams. Yeah, Matthew seems to like to mold things the way he likes. Yeah, and Kubert says, I love Matthew, though. I do, too. I love Matthew, too. I think Matthew is an awesome book. It still is one of my, I hate to say favorite, but Matthew certainly does have a spot in my heart, as much as I know about Matthew. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Kuberts. So, out of Egypt I called my son. And this is a very short quote, right? Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. Very short quote. Out of Egypt I called my son. Notice how Matthew doesn't really put this in context either. Yeah, like Isaiah chapter 7, for example, was taken. The context was supposed to be applicable to those who were alive. Excuse me. The king and Hezekiah, Isaiah, those who were alive in the day of Isaiah, because it says this sign was for that particular king. You see what's going on here. Yeah, Matthew is Matthewing. Exactly. Thank you again, Kuberts. Yeah, so out of Egypt I call my son. In Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, it says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. They called to them. This is verse 2. So they went from them. They sacrificed to the Baals and burned incense to engraved images. So in context, Hosea is not talking about one particular individual. He's talking about a they. He's talking about the people of Israel. Out of Egypt, I called Israel, my son. So this is typically believed to be talking about the Exodus, right? So Israel as a whole, the people of Israel, came out of Egypt. And this is how the Jewish people understand this. So Matthew is quoting this, but is he quoting it even like word for word? So Matthew says it's supposed to say, quote, out of Egypt I called my son, unquote. Hosea actually says, when Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. So it's not an exact quote, even though, the soundbite snippet means pretty much the same thing. Let's have a look at the Septuagint, and we'll see how that is worded. The Septuagint says, early in the morning were they cast off. The king of Israel has been cast off. For Israel is a child, and I loved him, and out of Egypt I have called his children. Wow. Wow. So you might say, well, there it looks like Matthew is quoting from the Hebrew and not from the Septuagint. It looks like it, yeah. In this translation, it does. However, I do suspect that the Brenton translators probably took the Hebrew word for b'nai, son or sons, and translated it as children, which it could probably be translated as son as well. So it's kind of a catch-22. Did Matthew actually quote from the Hebrew or from the Greek? I think probably the Greek, but I mean, we're looking at a translation here anyway, right? But at face value, our translations, it looks more like the Hebrew. It looks more like the WEB translation. Okay. So the next one. We should be keeping a score here. How many times does Matthew quote from the Septuagint versus the Masoretic? Masoretic points, Septuagint points, and either or points, So we have the next one is just a few verses later in verse 18. That's Matthew chapter 2, verse 18. And that is supposed to be quoting from Jeremiah chapter 31. So let's check this out. Matthew chapter 2, verse 18. A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children. She wouldn't be comforted because they are no more. This is such an intriguing passage to me. And I say that because even in Jeremiah's day, so this is a quote from Jeremiah, or at least supposed to be, but even in Jeremiah's day, Rachel, like the real Rachel, was long gone. You see? And certainly long gone by the time Yeshua was on the scene. So Matthew ties that to the massacre of the innocents done by Herod, at least according to the Gospel of Matthew anyway. We spoke about this a couple weeks ago, about a week and a half ago. This whole story of Herod slaughtering the innocents most likely did not historically happen. And we covered this before. We went through all the evidence, and we do have evidence to say that. So Matthew is doing what you might call a Haggadah here. He's drafting a story to convey an underlying spiritual lesson or truth, or for another purpose. I think here he's making Yeshua the second Moses, basically. What he's doing here is he is connecting the prophecy of the prophet to come from Deuteronomy chapter 18, when Moses prophesied, there, after I'm gone, basically, a prophet will arise and you shall listen to him. And, I do believe that was talking about Yeshua. And it seems like Matthew is, in a very elaborate way, connecting Yeshua to that prophecy, saying that this prophet that Moses spoke of, because it says prophet like me, in Deuteronomy chapter 18, Moses prophesied that this prophet that is to come is supposed to be like Moses. So I think what Matthew's doing here is he is making, he's presenting this theological concept that Yeshua is, Yeshua is this prophet that Moses prophesied, like unto Moses. And this is how much like unto Moses he was. He went to Egypt, just like Moses went to Egypt, right? He went to Egypt. And he came out of Egypt. And when Moses was born, Pharaoh killed a lot of these little, the little innocent children. And in the same way, as Matthew puts it, that Herod did. So he's constructing this theological concept. So he says this was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah in verse 17. So let's go over to Jeremiah and we'll take a look at it. So this is Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. And it says, quote, Yahweh says, a voice is heard in Ramah. Let's have a look. Is that what Matthew says it's supposed to be? Yep. Voice is heard in Ramah. Okay. Let's have a look at the Jeremiah of the Septuagint to see what that says. Verse 15. It says, a voice was heard in Ramah. So that all of them match. The Hebrew continues, lamentation and bitter weeping. Matthew says it's supposed to be lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. So, yeah, okay, so it's not word for word, but it means the same. And the Septuagint says lamentation and weeping and wailing. So hold on a second. We got different lamentation and bitter weeping in the Hebrew, lamentation, weeping, and wailing in the Septuagint, and Matthew says lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. So there, I think we should all, I hope we all agree on this, that Matthew is quoting from the Septuagint here. It aligns more closely with the Septuagint because Matthew has three elements here: lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Lamentation, weeping, and great mourning. Whereas the Hebrew only says two: lamentation and bitter weeping. Whereas the Septuagint says lamentation, weeping, and wailing. So it's closer to the lamentation, weeping, and great mourning as opposed to just simply in the Hebrew bitter weeping. The Hebrew goes on to say, Rachel weeping for her children. The Septuagint, Rachel weeping, Rachel would not cease weeping for her children because they are not. Well, that's quite a bit different than what we have in the Masoretic. Rachel weeping for her children, period. And then she refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Matthew says, it's supposed to say, Rachel weeping for her children, she wouldn't be comforted because they are no more. So what does he align with more here? Does he align with the Masoretic? Or does he align with the Septuagint? Rachel would not cease weeping for her children because they are not. And the Masoretic has got it put in two different sentences here. Rachel weeping for her children, period. She refuses to be comforted for her children, comma, because they are no more. Matthew says Rachel weeping for her children, semicolon, she wouldn't be comforted because they are no more. So it appears to be a little bit more like the Masoretic. I know that the argument can be made that the Septuagint and the Masoretic, they all say the same thing. It's just a different wording. So Matthew, the Hebrew, and the Septuagint are very much alike, all together. It appears at face value that Matthew is more aligned with the Masoretic text here. Okay, next one. Matthew chapter 3, verse 3, and that's supposed to be a quotation of Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. So Matthew chapter 3, verse 3 says, "For this is he who was spoken of by Isaiah the prophet, specifically, saying, quote, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make the way of the Lord ready, make his paths straight." Unquote. So the Hebrew says in Isaiah 40, verse 3, the voice of one who calls out. Wait a second. Matthew says the voice of one crying in the wilderness. But the Hebrew says the voice of one who calls out. Prepare the way of Yahweh in the wilderness. Make a level highway in the desert for our God. So that is different. Matthew puts it like the voice is in the wilderness, and Isaiah puts it like, no, the voice is not in the wilderness, but the voice is calling out for people to prepare the way of Yahweh in the wilderness. Let's see what the Septuagint has to say. The Septuagint says in verse 3, look at this, folks. Look at this. The voice of one crying in the wilderness. Now, this is pretty clear. Matthew is quoting from the Septuagint here. Here's a question. We just started. There are hundreds of references in the New Testament, quotations, direct references of the, quote unquote, Old Testament passages. We're just starting here. And so much we see already of the Septuagint quoted in the New Testament and not the Hebrew. Here's a question. If this is correct, and it looks like, it's right there, folks. I don't know how anybody can deny what we have here. So if it is what it is, then why is it that Christians go by the Hebrew and not the Septuagint? Most of them, that is. Especially in the West, Protestants. Okay? So Roman Catholics, I know they go more by the Latin, I think, the Latin manuscript and such, but especially Protestant Bibles. So I kind of, quote unquote, grew up in the Lord, believing that the Hebrew was the original, and I never thought to test, to do what we're doing today. I never thought to just, test to see whether the New Testament actually quoted the Old Testament properly. I never thought to test it. So, but we see here that Matthew is not quoting the Hebrew, he's quoting the Septuagint. Here's Matthew again, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. The Hebrew just says the voice of one who calls out. But the Septuagint says the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Okay, so the Hebrew goes on to say, prepare the way of Yahweh in the wilderness, and prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness. See what Matthew says. It's supposed to say, make the way of the Lord ready. So it doesn't say in the wilderness in that phrase. in Matthew. So the Septuagint says, prepare ye the way of the Lord. Make straight the paths of our God. And that very much lines up with Matthew here. See this? See this, folks? So this, again, is evidence that the author of the Gospel of Matthew used the Septuagint. I suppose if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty and splitting hairs, you could say, well, you don't know that for sure, Christopher. And to that I will say yes, because there is another option. The other option is that whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew could have used another Hebrew manuscript that has since been lost, the same Hebrew that the translators of the Septuagint used. You see what I'm saying? So the Septuagint is a Greek translation of a more ancient Hebrew. The so-called original Hebrew, the Masoretic text, is not really original. As you can see, it's so many differences. So it's either A, Matthew quoted from the Septuagint, or B, he quoted from a Hebrew manuscript that we don't have anymore, that would be the same manuscript that the translators of the Septuagint used to translate the Septuagint into Greek. You see? I don't see any other options. I mean, I don't see any other plausible options here. So here is a really good piece of evidence, if we're keeping score, that the Septuagint certainly got one on that one. So that was Matthew 3:3. Interestingly enough, the next quotation is in Matthew 4:4. Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, and this is supposed to be a quotation of Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. Matthew 4:4 says, but he answered, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of God's mouth. Okay, so this is in the context of the quote-unquote temptation of Christ. So Yeshua is rebutting the devil, if you will, and he's quoting, apparently. It is written, quote and unquote. So let's compare this with the actual text. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8, or verse 3, excuse me. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3. Now this is a long verse. He humbled you, allowed you to be hungry, and fed you with manna, which you didn't know. Neither did your fathers know, that he might teach you that man does not live by bread only, but man lives by every word that proceeds out of Yahweh's mouth. So the quotation here is just the last phrase of this whole verse. So it's not a full verse quotation. But man lives by every word. Man does not live by bread only, but man lives by every word that proceeds out of Yahweh's mouth. The Septuagint says, I'll read the last phrase here. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God shall man live. Wow. Okay. So Matthew uses God instead of Lord here. Let's take a look at the other Bible translations to see if any other translation used the word Lord. King James, God. New King James, God with a footnote. Well, the footnote is just a reference to Deuteronomy 8:3. NLT, God. NIV, God. ESV, God. CSB, God. NASB, God. Let's be God. So they're all saying that Matthew actually said God. That's a big clue, folks, because the Hebrew doesn't use that word God. It has the tetragrammaton in there. Yud, He, Waw, He, which the WEB translators has translated as Yahweh. So that and that alone shows that Matthew used the Septuagint, or a Hebrew manuscript that more aligns with the Septuagint, to quote from. Let's check the other part. So we got Matthew saying, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of God's mouth. The Hebrew says, man does not live by bread only, but man lives by every word that proceeds out of Yahweh's mouth. Septuagint, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds. So you can see that Matthew certainly lines up more with the Septuagint and not the Hebrew. Isn't this interesting? So if Matthew uses the Septuagint so much, why is it that Christians don't? Protestant Christians don't? Why is it that they believe that Matthew is actually quoting from the Hebrew when he's not here? At least not the Masoretic Hebrew. So let's check our next reference is just actually the very next couple verses is in Matthew chapter 4 verse 6, and this is referencing Psalm 91 verses 11 and 12. Psalm 91, you know what this is all about? You know, again, there's the temptation of Christ, and in Matthew chapter 4 verse 6, and said to him, so this is the devil speaking to Jesus here, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you won't dash your foot against a stone. Okay. All right, so the Masoretic says, the Hebrew says, for he will put his angels in charge of you to guard you in all your ways, that they will bear you up in their hands so that you won't dash your foot against a stone. So, according to Matthew, the devil takes the first part of that. He will command his angels concerning you. He will put his angels in charge over you, the Hebrew says, which is pretty much the same thing in different words. Matthew says, on their hands they shall bear you up, and you will not dash your foot against a stone. The Hebrew says they will bear you up in their hands so that you won't dash your foot against a stone. The Septuagint, for he shall give his angels charge concerning you, to keep you in all your ways, that they shall bear you up on their hands, lest at any time you dash your foot against a stone. So this quotation, it seems to be more in line with the Hebrew there, because there's not like at any time. Yeah. Although again, you know, for sure somebody would say, well, the Masoretic or the Hebrew says so that you don't dash your foot against a stone, and that matches, Matthew matches that there. On their hands they will bear you up so that you don't dash your foot against a stone. But someone might argue that the Septuagint, lest at any time thou dash thy foot against a stone, means the same thing. So really, it seems to lean a little bit more towards the Masoretic there. Okay, and that's assuming that the Brenton is a correct translation of the Greek. If it's not, then Matthew might just line up with the Greek word for word. And the next verse, Matthew chapter 4, verse 7 is another one. So Jesus said again, it is written, you shall not test the Lord your God. Now this should be pretty straightforward and it should be pretty easy because, it's a very short quote. It shouldn't be, it'd be hard to mess this one up. So that's from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 16 in the Hebrew says, you shall not tempt Yahweh your God as you tempted him in Massah. So yeah, again, it's a part of a sentence that's quoted here. It's not a full verse. It's only half of the sentence. The Septuagint, okay, so that was verse 16. Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God as you tempted him in the temptation. Yeah, so you could say it's all pretty much the same there. Again, Matthew chapter 4, verse 10. Lots of Matthew chapter 4 here. Matthew chapter 4, verse 10 quotes, or at least supposed to quote, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13. So Matthew chapter 4, verse 10 says, then Jesus said to him, get behind me, Satan, for it is written, quote, you shall worship the Lord your God, and you shall serve him only, unquote. Should be pretty easy to match that one up. The Masoretic, it says, you shall fear Yahweh your God, and you shall serve him, and you shall swear by his name. So that's different. Yeah, so that's quite different. The Septuagint, verse 13, you shall fear the Lord your God, and him only shalt thou serve, and you shall cleave to him, and by his name you shall swear. Well, that's even more different. So the Masoretic just simply says, you shall fear Yahweh your God, and you shall serve him, and shall swear by his name. The Septuagint says, you shall fear the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve, and you shall cleave to him, and by his name you shall swear. Matthew says it's supposed to say, you shall worship the Lord your God, and you shall serve him only. That's so different, folks. I'm wondering, is there anything else this could match up to? Seriously. Why do we have such a difference? Okay, so let's look at I'm going to go to the Blue Letter Bible and check out some of the cross references here to see if there's any other cross references that we can look at here that perhaps this would match closer to. So Matthew chapter 4, verse 10, if we go to the tools, cross references, and we go down to thou shalt worship the Lord thy God. So we got Deuteronomy 6, 13 and 14. So it includes the next verse as well. Deuteronomy 10, 20. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13, you shall fear the Lord your God. This is from the Hebrew. And serve him, and shall swear by his name. You shall not go after other gods of the gods of the people which are around about you. I'm still just shaking my head because it's so different. So Matthew chapter 4, verse 10 says, that the scripture is supposed to say, you shall worship the Lord your God and you shall serve him only. But it doesn't actually say that in the book of Deuteronomy at all, anywhere like this. So what's going on here? What is Matthew doing? Is this proof that what Matthew is doing is basically, instead of quoting, he is paraphrasing and reading his own interpretation into it? Here's a question. Is this the only gospel that records this event? Because if we have other gospels that record this, we can say, okay, we got something to compare this to. But if Matthew is the only gospel that has this event, then we can say, okay, it looks like Matthew might be just doing a Matthew here. He might be just Matthewing, as Hubert said earlier. I think Matthew is Matthewing, which he very well could be. And that is kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, making stuff up. Not that what he made up is not true. In essence, it's true. Certainly, in essence, it's true. But it's not the accurate portrayal of what the actual scriptures say word for word. So we do have a parallel account in, in Luke. And we're going to go over there. This would be Luke chapter 4 and verse 8. So Luke says, Jesus answered him, "Get behind me, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and you shall serve him only." So it's very much like what Matthew said here. You shall worship the Lord your God, and you shall serve him only. And this is probably why some scholars believe that Luke had Matthew as one of his sources. Because Matthew didn't actually quote from the quote-unquote Old Testament, the Tanakh, at all. He didn't quote from it. And neither did Luke. It seems like it's a word-for-word, copy here. We have Mark chapter 1 also talking about this kind of stuff. Mark chapter 1, let's have a look at this. And we're going to look at verse 12 and 13. Mark doesn't say anything about the dialogue between Yeshua and the devil. It just says, immediately the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. He was there in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and the angels were serving him. And that's it. So the only ones that actually report on a specific dialogue is Matthew and Luke. However, this does not match with the word for word verbatim quotation of the Old Testament. So, what does that teach us? I think that shows us that the ancient writers in the New Testament they didn't think or write like how we do. We are a lot more like legalistic, legal-minded. Like if we're going to quote Johnny as saying something, it better be a direct and verbatim quote. Otherwise, it's inaccurate and it's fake news, right? But back in those days, it seems like people, and we'll see this more and more as we go on, when they supposedly quoted, it wasn't a verbatim quote, but rather kind of like a summary. Again, if I did this kind of stuff, if I quoted from the scriptures like this, people will hate me a lot more than they do now. Okay, so Matthew chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. It says this. Matthew chapter 4 is full of all these references, by the way. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, toward the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness saw a great light. To those who sat in the region, a shadow of death to them, a shadow of death and a shadow of death, to them light has dawned. So this is supposed to be from a quotation from the prophet Isaiah, according to verse 14. So let's check out this quotation. So this is supposed to be from Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. And we're going to do the same thing here. We'll go to Hebrew and to the Septuagint to have a look at this. So Isaiah chapter 9, it says, "But there shall be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali." So hold on a second here. Matthew says it's supposed to say, quote, "the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali toward the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles." It doesn't say that. It says, "In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made it glorious by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations." So this is referring to the Gentiles. So it's way different. Let's have a look at the Septuagint. It says, so the verse, it's weird because it starts like halfway through the verse. "O land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, and the rest inhabiting the sea coast, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles." So look at this. Matthew lines up a lot more with the Septuagint here. The Septuagint sounds a lot more like what Matthew's saying. Let's compare it again. Matthew says it's supposed to say land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali toward the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The Hebrew says he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made it glorious by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The Septuagint says, "O land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, land of Naphtali, and the rest inhabiting the sea coast and the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles." So far, folks, Matthew lines up with the Septuagint very, very well there. The next verse in the Hebrew, Isaiah 9, verse 2, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light." Okay, so Matthew says it's supposed to say the people who sat in darkness saw a great light. Sat in darkness versus walked in darkness in the Hebrew. The Septuagint says, "O people walking in darkness, behold a great light." So that makes more sense. If you walk in dark, I do believe this is a figure of speech. Like, I used to live in I was, in the kingdom of darkness, and now I'm in the kingdom of light. I used to be walking in the darkness, spiritually speaking. Now I'm in the light. Right? So Matthew doesn't really line up with the Hebrew or the Septuagint here, as it says in the WEB, the people who sat in great dark. Let's check out the other Bible translations. So the other Bible translations, so this is Matthew 4:16. The other Bible translations say, King James says sat in darkness. New King James says sat in darkness. NLT says sat. NIV says living in darkness. ESV, dwelling in darkness. CSB, live in darkness. So it could be just a King James discrepancy here. people who were sitting in darkness in the NASB, sitting, or so some translations say sitting, some say living. Either way, the Masoretic says the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. The Septuagint, oh, people walking in darkness, behold a great light. The difference, the Septuagint is in the present tense and the Masoretic is in the past tense. Okay. According to Matthew, the next part of it should say, to those who sat in the region of in the region and shadow of death. To those who sat, again sitting, in the region and shadow of death. The Masoretic says, the light has shined on those who lived in the land of the shadow of death. The Septuagint says, you that dwell in the region of the shadow of death, a light shall shine upon you. So it seems to me, folks, that once again, we have another point going towards the Septuagint. Those who sat in the region of the shadow of death, to them has a light has dawned, according to Matthew. The Hebrew doesn't really say it like that. The Hebrew is like, the light has shined on those who lived in the land of the shadow of death. The Septuagint, you that dwell in the region and shadow of death, a light shall shine upon you. Right. So I would say that the Matthew, once again, aligns more with the Septuagint as opposed to the Masoretic. Another one, Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. And this is supposed to be a quotation of Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. It says, you have heard that it was said to the ancient ones, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. Okay, so the actual text, Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. It just says, you shall not murder. Okay. So it doesn't say anything about what, at least not in that reference, that whoever murders shall be in danger of the judgment. But of course they would be anyway. But the way that Matthew puts it is that this is supposed to be a quotation, a reference. So the Septuagint, I would expect it to be pretty much the same, perhaps just very insignificant differences. You shall not kill. Yeah. Actually, thou shalt not murder is a little bit more of a accurate translation there. Another one is in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. And it says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And of course, that's another reference to the so-called 10 Commandments. So Exodus 20:14, you shall not commit adultery. Yeah, I mean, you can't really mess that up. The Septuagint, you shall not commit adultery. Pretty simple. And then we have Matthew chapter 5, verse 31. This is supposed to be Deuteronomy chapter 24. Matthew chapter 5, verse 31. And it was also said, whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorce. Whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorce. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, when a man takes a wife and marries her, then it shall be, if she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some unseemly thing in her, that he shall write her a certificate of divorce, put it in her hand, and send her out of his house. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 from the Septuagint, and if anyone should take a wife and should dwell with her, then it shall come to pass, if she should not have found favor before him, because he has found some unbecoming thing in her, that he shall write for her a bill of divorcement and give it into her hands. He shall send her away out of his house. So what Matthew is quoting here, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorce. So it doesn't say, again, this is a paraphrase. It doesn't say this verbatim, because Deuteronomy 24 in the Hebrew, it doesn't really say. It's more of a paraphrase than it is verbatim. You'd think that it should be a verbatim quote, the way that it seems to come across in Matthew chapter 5, or in the New Testament, as a whole, really. And the way that we read it today, the way that we would think of it today, you think that, it should be like a real quotation, word for word, but it's not. So Matthew is not word for word in either of those. Matthew chapter 5, verse 33 is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 12. So we're going to look at this as well within the Masoretic and the Hebrew. Verse 33, Matthew chapter 5, verse 33. Again, you have heard that it was said to the ancient ones, you shall not make false vows, but shall perform to the Lord your vows. Okay, so Leviticus 19, verse 12. It actually says, you shall not swear by my name falsely and profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. The Septuagint. And you shall not swear unjustly by my name, and you shall not profane the name of the Lord your God. You shall not profane the holy name of your God. I am the Lord your God. So, yet again, we have what supposed to be, at least it looks like it's supposed to be, a verbatim quotation, but it's not. It's just more of a summary. And those of you, a lot of people would hazard in for the NLT translation, for example, or any kind of paraphrase Bible, like the Message or something like that. Well, if you have it in for these Bibles because they paraphrase and are not literal word for word translations, you got a problem, because there's a lot of this kind of stuff going on within the New Testament itself, not word for word. This is more of a paraphrase. This is like the Message kind of rendition of the actual text. The next one is Matthew chapter 5, verse 40 or verse 38. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38, and it says, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and a tooth for a tooth. Period. Okay, so the actual text is found in Exodus 21:24. So if we go over to Exodus chapter 21, verse 24, it says, quote, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Again, a partial quote, not even an entire sentence, just a phrase, a couple phrases from a sentence. That's it. That's how these people quoted. Exodus chapter 21, verse 24, in the Septuagint, it says, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So, yeah, again, it's so simple and so straightforward. I can't see how anybody would mess that up. But what do we learn from this? Again, so we learn that the authors, at least Matthew, of the New Testament did not quote verbatim. More of a paraphrase. Picking and choosing little phrases within a verse, even within a sentence. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43. We'll scroll down here to verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, okay, so it actually says, this is in Matthew, or in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. It says, you shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. So this, we have to ask a question. Is Matthew quoting from the Torah here? Or is he quoting from some other saying that went around? Is this supposed to be a verbatim quote from the Torah? Right? At least it's partially found in the Torah. So Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18 in the Septuagint says, and your hand shall not avenge you, and you shall not be angry with the children of your people. You shall love your neighbors yourself. I am the Lord. So it actually says the opposite to what Matthew said. So it actually says to love your enemy in more or less words. You shall not take vengeance. You shall not bear a grudge. All that kind of stuff. So in other words, you shall love your enemy. So here's a question. Did Matthew quote from the Torah? Is this a quotation from the Torah? If it is, it's a misquote. Or is this a quotation about something other than the Torah? Is this a quotation of something that was, like it's a saying that went around back in those days? Certainly is far from what the Torah says. Matthew chapter 8, verse 17 is our next one. And that is a quotation of Isaiah 53, verse 4. Matthew chapter 8, verse 17. Well, let's start with verse 16, sorry. When evening came, they brought to him many possessed with demons. He cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. That it might be fulfilled, which was spoken through Isaiah the prophet, saying, quote, he took our infirmities and bore our diseases. So Isaiah chapter 53, verse 4 says this. Surely he has borne our sicknesses and carried our suffering, yet we considered him plagued, struck by God, and afflicted. Okay. And if you go over to the Septuagint version of that, the Septuagint says, he bears our sins and is pained for us, yet we accounted him to be in trouble and in suffering and in affliction. So it sounds a little bit more like the Masoretic here. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases, although neither the Masoretic nor the Septuagint really says that word for word. The Masoretic says, surely he has borne our sickness. The Septuagint talks about pain, which could be a translation for disease, but it says he bears our sins. And his pain for us. Yet we accounted him to be in trouble and in suffering and in affliction. Okay. Matthew chapter 9, verse 13 is our next one. And that is from Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. Matthew chapter 9, verse 13 says, "But you go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Hosea chapter 6, verse 6 from the Masoretic says, "For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings." The Septuagint, we'll change this over to the Septuagint, says, "For I will have mercy rather than sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than whole burnt offerings." Okay. So Matthew, it looks like, it sounds a little bit more like the Masoretic, although this is the WEB translation of the Masoretic, and it could be just like how we saw in the first one with Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, where the translators actually match it with the New Testament against what the actual Hebrew says. That could be the case. The Septuagint says, "For I will have mercy rather than sacrifice." So that word "will" could also mean desire, so this is what I will, this is what I want, this is what I desire. I will have mercy rather than sacrifice. So I would say they're all pretty much equal. Matthew chapter 10, verses 35 to 36. And we will compare that with Micah chapter 7, verse 6. Matthew chapter 10, verse 35. "For I came to set a man at odds against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's foes will be those of his own household." Micah chapter 7, verse 6 says, "For the son dishonors the father, the daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own house." Yeah, so it's a lot more elaborate than what we have in Matthew. In the Septuagint, it says, "For the son dishonors the father, the daughter will rise up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. For in those in his house shall be all a man's enemies." It appears to me like that Matthew is, again, it's a paraphrase, it's a rewording of what it actually says, as opposed to a verbatim quotation. Matthew chapter 11, verse 10, and we'll compare that with Malachi chapter 3. Matthew chapter 11, verse 10 says, let's go with verse 9. "But why did you go out? To see a prophet? Yes, I tell you, and much more than a prophet." Speaking of John the Baptist. "For this is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you." Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." And that's just a third of what that verse says. The Septuagint says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." So it's pretty much the same. Oh, sorry. That's not the Septuagint. That's the Masoretic, sorry. The Septuagint says, "Behold, I send forth my messenger, and he shall survey the way before me." So Matthew, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you." It's not a verbatim of either the Masoretic or the Septuagint. You see how we got the Masoretic and the Septuagint? It doesn't say before your face. Neither is it talking about yours. It's before me. I will send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, in both manuscripts. So Matthew either had a different manuscript or he changed it to make it say what he wanted it to say. If you have a problem with that, please let me know why you have a problem with that in the live chat. And also, what's your evidence? Do you think that what I said is wrong? And if so, what's your evidence? Okay, so we're comparing the New Testament with the quote-unquote Old Testament. Matthew chapter 12, verse 7. This is again comparing what we already read before, Hosea 6:6. So Matthew chapter 12, verse 7 says, again, "But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you wouldn't have condemned the guiltless." Okay, so Hebrew, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Septuagint, I will have mercy rather than sacrifice. And by the way, this is the Old Testament. Christians, this is Old Testament. You might say, "Oh, but the New Testament's all mercy and the Old Testament's all sacrifice and blood sacrifice." No, it's not. The Old Testament tells you, and I'm being rhetorical here because I'm using, the old Christianese to prove a point here. The so-called Old Testament in Hosea talks about how God desires mercy, not sacrifice. Hebrews, yeah, thank you, Hebrews. It's also the Old Testament, by the way, Habakkuk, where it says, "The just shall live by faith." The great Paulian, the great passage that Paul puts so much of his doctrine on. It's Old Testament. The same chapter, Matthew chapter 12, verses 18 to 21. And it says, let's start with verse 15 to get more context here. Jesus perceiving that, withdrew from there. Great multitudes followed him, and he healed them all. He commanded them that they should not make him known, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken through Isaiah the prophet, saying, quote, "Behold my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit on him. He will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not strive nor shout, neither will anyone hear his voice in the streets. He won't break a bruised reed. He won't quench a smoking flax until he leads justice to victory. In his name, the nations will hope." Wow. Unquote. So there's a long quotation. It's supposed to be a quotation. Let's see what it really says. So this is supposed to be from Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 4. And we're going to, again, compare the different manuscripts, Masoretic text, the so-called original Hebrew, with the more ancient Septuagint. So the original text says, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen." So let's go bite by bite here. So Matthew says, Behold my servant whom I have chosen. So it doesn't say anything about being upheld here like it does in the Masoretic. The Septuagint says, Jacob is my servant. I will help him. What? What? Is this the same? So look at how different this is, folks. You might say, oh, but we go by the Hebrew, right? Well, do you know we have older manuscripts as opposed to the so-called original Hebrew? The original Hebrew is not that old. It's the Masoretic text. Here we have an older manuscript, the Septuagint, which predates it by at least several hundred years. And it is so different, as you can see here. So incredibly different. Jacob is my servant versus Jacob my chosen, or Jacob. So the Masoretic says, behold my servant in whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. The Septuagint, Jacob is my servant. I will help him. Israel is my chosen. My soul has accepted him. What in the world? Is this the same text? Wow. So, right off the bat, Matthew seems to go more with the Hebrew here. So there are times when Matthew seems to be quoting from the Septuagint, clearly from the Septuagint, as opposed to the Masoretic Hebrew tradition. Now this time, it's not like this at all, unless we have another version of the Septuagint that I don't have here in front of me, because I'm using the Brenton Septuagint. Matthew says, behold my servant whom I have chosen. It aligns more with the Hebrew, although the Hebrew is different anyway. Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen. But the Septuagint is way different, way different. Jacob is my servant. I will help him. Israel is my chosen. My soul has accepted him. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall bring forth judgment to the Gentiles. Okay, so the Hebrew says, in whom my soul delights, I have put my spirit on him. He will bring justice to the nations. Matthew says, my beloved in whom my soul is well pleased, I will put my spirit on him. He will proclaim justice to the nations. So what, is that closer to the Hebrew or the Septuagint? So the last part of that seems to be pretty much the same amongst all three. You might say, well, the Septuagint says judgment, so that's not justice. Well, it means the same thing really in the original text, judgment and justice. Like righteous judgment is justice. According to Matthew, the next sentence is supposed to say, he will not strive nor shout. Let's take it one bite at a time. He will not strive nor shout. The Hebrew says, he will not shout nor raise his voice. It doesn't say anything about striving. So the Septuagint says, he shall not cry nor lift up his voice. He will not he shall not shout nor. So the Hebrew says he shall not shout nor raise his voice. Septuagint, pretty much the same. But Matthew says strive. Why is that? That's different. Well, we're going to get on here with the next few verses. Matthew says it's supposed to say after that, he won't break, neither will anyone hear his voice in the streets. The Hebrew says, nor cause it to be heard in the street. Septuagint, nor shall his voice be heard without. So again, this passage, Matthew seems to go with the Hebrew here. in this passage. Really, really interesting. Okay, folks. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of a break. I'm going to put a little bit of music on. I'll be back in a few minutes. Enjoy, folks.
World, he said, no earthly crown, no throne of men, but where the Spirit sets you free, there's a kingdom. Come and see the kingdom of God, the kingdom of light, breaking the darkness, shining so bright. Not far away, not yet to come, the kingdom is here, his will is done. Words come and soul, guidance from the throne. Torah's light shines through, faith's always true. In the silence of night, Torah brings the light. Ancient scrolls survive, keeping hope alive. Sacred scrolls of fire, lift us high as fire. God's eternal grace, shining in our face. Oh, victored by divine hand, more that helps us stand. By the ancient fire, hearts that never tire. Through the desert sands, Torah in our hands. Whispers of the past, promises that last. Sacred scrolls of fire, lift us high as fire. God's eternal grace, shining in our face. Sacred scrolls of fire, lift us high as fire. God's eternal grace, shining in our face. Oh. Through the desert sands of night, Torah brings the light. Ancient scrolls survive, keeping hope alive. Sacred scrolls of fire, lift us high as fire. God's eternal grace, shining in our face. Oh, written by divine hand, Lord, that helps us stand. By the ancient fire, hearts that never tire. Written by divine hand, Lord, that helps us stand. By the ancient fire, hearts that never tire. Through the desert sands, Torah in our hands. Whispers of the past, promises that last, things that last. Sacred scrolls of fire, lift us high as fire. God's eternal grace, shining in our face. Oh.
Ancient scrolls of fire. All right. Okay, well, let's continue on here. Matthew chapter 12, verse 20. He won't break a bruised reed. He won't break a bruised reed. That's what Matthew says that Isaiah 42 should say. it says he won't break a bruised reed in the Hebrew. So that matches up. Septuagint, a bruised reed he shall not break. Okay, so pretty much the same. The next thing that Matthew says is that he won't quench a smoking flax. In the Hebrew, it says he won't quench a dimly burning wick. So that's a little bit different. Dimly burning wick versus smoking. Okay, so you could say that's different. I guess you can have a dimly burning one without actually being smoking. In the Septuagint, now it looks like the Septuagint says, and smoking flax shall he not quench. So that matches. So there, Matthew is back to the Septuagint again. So you might say, well, what is he doing? Has he got like different manuscripts? He's just kind of picking and choosing which one that he wants to quote. I don't know. Maybe that's what he's doing. But it could be too that he just has a manuscript, and I think it's very likely that he has a certain manuscript that he's quoting from that is lost, like a certain family or a certain flavor, if you will, or a certain translation that is lost. Or perhaps he's just going by memory, Maybe it's just memory that he hears it in the synagogue all the time, and he's just going by memory. That's another thing it could be as well. Paraphrase from the rabbis. Okay, so Matthew says it should say he won't quench a smoking flask until he leads justice to victory. The Hebrew says he won't quench a dimly burning wick, period. And then it says he will faithfully bring justice. Faithfully bring justice versus until he leads justice to victory. Well, Matthew being Matthew, this could be, let's check to see what the Septuagint says, okay? This could be just Matthew, but the Septuagint says, but he shall bring forth judgment to truth. So, Matthew, justice to victory sounds a lot better, doesn't it? Brings forth justice to victory. And then we got Septuagint says brings forth judgment to truth. So either one of two things is going on. So it seems like he's quoting from the Septuagint. So it's either that it's a translation thing here, or perhaps Matthew is doing what Matthew commonly does, and he adds a little bit of flavor to the scene. Justice to victory. Judgment to truth, well, that sounds good, but I think I'll make it into justice to victory instead. And then the last sentence, according to Matthew, is supposed to say, in his name, the nations will hope. Of course, this is talking about the Gentiles. The nations will hope. The Hebrew, where is it in the Hebrew? It says he will not fail nor be discouraged until he has set justice in the earth and the islands wait for his law. So that is very different. Perhaps in a roundabout way it says the same thing. So according to Matthew, it's supposed to say, in his name the nations will hope. But it actually says he will not fail nor be discouraged until he has set justice in the earth and the islands will wait for his law. Let's see what the Septuagint has to say. The Septuagint says, he shall shine out. Let's look at the Masoretic. It says he will not fail. So yeah, this is what we have so often, right? The law of it's like a law that we have discovered here on this channel, that when there are two different manuscripts that vary vastly, usually the other ones also vary vastly. And this is what we see here. Like, wow, this is so different. Matthew claims that the next sentence should say, in his name, the nations will hope. But it doesn't. In the Hebrew, it says, he will not fail, nor be discouraged. The Septuagint says, he shall shine out and shall not be discouraged. Okay. The Hebrew, this is so different here, folks. It's so different. I have to think, okay, how do I even compare this? How do you even compare these ones? So where do I start? Okay, so the Matthew is like just so different. I'm about to say completely different, but it's a vague resemblance. Vague, I should say. Vague resemblance, at least in meaning anyway. So the Hebrew says he will not fail nor be discouraged until he has set justice in the earth. The Septuagint says he shall shine out and shall not be discouraged until he have set judgment on the earth. According to the Hebrew, the last phrase should read, and the islands wait for his law. The Septuagint says, and in his name shall the Gentiles trust. There we have it. There we have it. Wow. Wow. This is Matthew. So Matthew is skipping a lot. He's quoting it as if it's verbatim, at least in our minds anyway, in our Western, legalistic minds that we expect a quotation to be verbatim, to be at least somewhat accurate. So Matthew is kind of at least on track until he gets to the last sentence, until he gets to the last verse. And he skips over 2/3 of the last verse. He just skips right to, and the islands, or the nations, well, in the I should say, from the Septuagint, and in his name shall the Gentiles trust, which matches Matthew, not word for word, but the actual concept is there. In his name, the nations, the Gentiles, will hope or trust, right? Ooh, wow, Matthew. If I quoted the scriptures like Matthew did, I'd be in big trouble. Okay, let's go to the next one. Matthew. So that's Matthew chapter 12. Let's go to Matthew chapter 13, and that is a supposed quotation from Isaiah chapter 6. Matthew chapter 13, verses 14 and 15. Supposed to be Isaiah chapter 6, verse 9. Okay. Matthew chapter 13, verse 14. In them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, quote, by hearing you will hear, and will in no way understand. Seeing you will see, and will in no way perceive. For this people's heart has grown callous. Their ears are dull of hearing, and they have closed their eyes. Or else, perhaps, they might perceive with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their heart, and would turn. There's that repentance. And I would heal them. Okay. So Isaiah, this is supposed to be from Isaiah. Chapter 6, verse 9. He said, go and tell this people, I'm reading from the Hebrew, by the way, the WEB translation of the Hebrew. He said, go and tell this people, you hear indeed, but don't understand. You see indeed, but don't perceive. Well, let's see what the Septuagint has to say. The Septuagint says, "Go and tell this people, you hear indeed, but don't understand. You see indeed, but don't perceive." Okay, so pretty much the same as the Masoretic. But Matthew says it's supposed to say, by hearing you will hear, and in no way understand. Seeing you will see, and in no way perceive. It looks like Matthew added a little bit there again, kind of does, he did what he loves to do, and that is adds a little bit, hearing you will hear, but not understand, and seeing you will see. There's this extra on it. Whereas in Isaiah, it literally doesn't, it doesn't repeat itself like this. It just simply says, you hear indeed, but don't understand. Okay. Somebody might make it an argument and say, well, the Hebrew does have this repetition in it. Let's go on to the next phrase from Matthew. The next phrase is supposed to be, for this people's heart has grown callous. It actually says, make the heart of this people fat. Wait a second. Matthew says it's supposed to say this people's heart has grown callous. So that would make me believe that it's supposed, it's talking about a hard heart, right? So it portrays the image of a hard heart, right? But that's not what we get from the Hebrew. Make the heart of this people fat. So that's different. The Septuagint says, make the heart of this people. Oh, sorry, that's not. I went to the Septuagint. I was doing the Hebrew instead of the Septuagint here. For the heart of this people has become gross. So I think this would mean, in the ancient way of saying, it would mean the same thing as what the Hebrew is saying. The heart of this people has become fat. Okay. The Gospel of Matthew says it's supposed to say, the next thing it's supposed to say is, their ears are dull of hearing. It actually says, make their ears heavy. Make their ears heavy. The Septuagint says, and their ears are dull of hearing. Oh, there we have a match. So there again, Matthew aligns more with the Septuagint, not the Masoretic Hebrew. The next phrase from Matthew says, and they have closed their eyes. And they have closed their eyes. In the Hebrew, and shut their eyes. Okay, so the Septuagint, and their eyes they have closed. Yeah, it does ring more with the Septuagint this time. All right, the next phrase from Matthew. Or else perhaps they might perceive with their eyes. Or else perhaps they might perceive with their eyes. The Hebrew says, lest they see with their eyes. The Septuagint says, lest they should see with their eyes. So the Septuagint in the Hebrew seems to be very much alike, not Matthew. Matthew goes on to say, hear with their ears, understand with their heart. Hebrew says, hear with their ears, understand with their heart. Okay, that matches with the Hebrew. Septuagint, hear with their ears and understand with their heart. That matches with the Septuagint. Okay. And Matthew says, and would turn again and would heal them. The Hebrew says, and turn again and be healed. Okay. And Septuagint, and be converted, and I should heal them. So, yeah, that's pretty much the same all across the board. Chipmunk says, seeing, hearing, heart equals doing, which equals healing. A fat heart is a hindrance to not do and obey. That's how I heard this. That is really good. Very, very good. Very, very good. Thank you for that. That's awesome. That's a great way of putting it. Next passage. Same chapter, chapter 13, Matthew chapter 13, verse 35. And that compares to Psalm 78, verse 2. Matthew 13, verse 35 says, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken through the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden from the foundation of the world. Psalm 78, verse 2, I will open my mouth in a parable, I will utter dark sayings of old. The Septuagint, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter dark sayings which have been from the beginning. So, once again, we have more of an alignment with the Septuagint. What do you guys like? You guys think that I'm wrong with this? So the Gospel of Matthew, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden from the foundation of the world. To me, it sounds that lines up more with the Septuagint, where it says, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter dark sayings which have been from the beginning. It's saying it in a different way, but it's from the foundation of the world. Whereas the Hebrew just says something like, I will open my mouth in a parable, I will utter dark sayings of old. Right? Right. Hubert says not at all, yeah. You see, Matthew is just, you got to wonder how he's quoting this and what actual manuscript he used there. Thank you, Cuberts. Next one is Matthew chapter 15, and that is a quotation of Exodus chapter 20. So Matthew chapter 15, verse 4. It says, for God commanded, honor your father and your mother, and, quote, he who speaks evil of his father and mother, let him be put to death. So Exodus chapter 20. Okay, so we go down here. This is verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which Yahweh your God gives you. And then the Septuagint. Honor your father and your mother, that it may be well with you, and that you may live long on a good land, which the Lord your God gives you. Well, it's different than the Hebrew, right? The Hebrew says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land which Yahweh your God gives you, versus honor your father and your mother, that it may be well with you, and that you may live long on the good land which the Lord your God gives to you. So Matthew chapter 15 seems to be quoting a couple different things. So that is Exodus chapter 20. And then if we look up the cross references, he that curses his father and mother, Exodus chapter 21. He that curses his father and mother or his mother shall surely be put to death. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 9. And for everyone that curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. he has cursed his father or his mother, his blood shall be upon him. So apparently there's a combination quote again in Matthew. So that Matthew does, so he picks one phrase out of Exodus and another phrase out of Exodus and perhaps some of these other parts of the Torah, and he puts them together. Hubert says, well said, Chipmunk. Yeah, I agree. That's awesome. Thank you again, Chipmunk. Good stuff. Isaiah chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, or Matthew, chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, is supposed to quote from Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13. So it says, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching as doctrine rules made by men. Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13. It says in the Hebrew, the Lord said, because this people draws near to me with their mouth and honors me with their lips, but they have removed their heart far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment of men which has been taught. So Matthew says, and they worship me in vain, teaching as doctrine rules made by men. So it doesn't really say that per se. It doesn't say they worship me in vain, teaching as doctrine rules made by men. It says, but they have removed their heart far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment of men which has been taught. Let's go to the Septuagint. So this is verse 13. And the Lord said, this people draw nigh to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching the commandments and doctrines of men. Okay, so there we have Matthew again aligning more with the Septuagint as opposed to the Masoretic Hebrew text. Isn't that something? Okay, well, I'm going to leave it right there at that right there for today, folks. Lord willing, we'll pick up again tomorrow. I am going to be posting a poll in the meantime as well for those of you who are members. Chipmunk says that fear part confuses me. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? So it just could be that the idea of fearing God in the healthiest way is or represents a worship, right? Because worship literally means to bow before him, right? So if you fear him in the right way, the healthy way, then there's that great honor, that great respect, knowing his power, knowing his word. And so that could be, in a sense, part of worship. But yeah, either way, Matthew certainly aligns more with the Septuagint there. Yeah, and that is confusing. I agree, Chipmunk. The fear of me in the Hebrew, the fear of me is a commandment of men which has been taught. It sounds like some deep underlying meaning there. perhaps it's like a, there are people that they don't really love God. Like they don't really love God fully. They know more. They're more afraid than they are a child. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, anyways, guys, if you haven't already, please leave a like, subscribe, and follow if you're new here. Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. That's 7:30 p.m. New York time, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll continue. All right, folks, if you haven't yet subscribed, make sure you do. And if you find any value here, please consider becoming a member of the channel. That way, help pitch in the pot to help cover the expenses and all that kind of stuff that goes on here. Thank you for your consideration, and thanks again, y'all that are members of the channel. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. It is you guys that actually fuel the engine here and keep things going as we have been. And we're on year number 5. We're on year number 5, guys. Almost every single day. So, thank you, and God bless you abundantly. All right, folks, so we'll see you, Lord willing, tomorrow. Until then, keep on calling on Him, and He will show you great and mighty things. Things that you don't know, Jeremiah 33:3. Chipmunk says, good study, Christopher, thank you. Many blessings to you and family. May everyone feel at their best, be prosperous, and receive wings from God. Amen, amen. Thank you, Chipmunk. I appreciate that. Blessings and health and prosperity and wisdom and wings from God multiplied back to you as well. Thank you. Okay, folks, we will see you tomorrow then. You guys are awesome. You guys are world changers. Love you guys. Much love, good health, and long life to you. I pray the Lord bless you and keep you, make His face to shine upon you, lift up His countenance upon you, and give you wonderful, wonderful shalom. Amen, amen. We'll see you guys tomorrow.